Good evening, class. This is a discussion post, for chapters 12 to 14. I decided to go ahead and to answer the first discussion question, which comes from chapter number 12. The first part of the question says, select one of the stage models of grief and describe the stages it proposes. I wanted to discuss the Keebler-Ross stages, and her stages are identified in five stages, which are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And then Kubler-Ross goes on to state that people go through as they come to grips with their own imminent death. So this is specifically talking about stages in one's own personal life, not what they experience as they're seeing somebody else, but in their own imminence of grief and loss within their own being. And the reason why I chose this particular one is I actually had the opportunity to read, I believe, two of her books when I did the independent study for grief and loss counseling. And I was intrigued by her memoirs, if you will, of her own experience with the grief and loss process. And part of what made me so motivated and innovated in the grief and loss study, um, as far as to make that my understudy in counseling, is because I feel like grief and loss is not dealt with properly. It's not dealt with properly in the secular world. It's not dealt with properly even in areas of faith based belief. And so I personally felt that this would be my area of expertise because of the fact that it's not handled properly. I wanted to do that, and that was stemmed specifically from Keebler Ross's book that I read in my grief and loss counseling class. The next part of the question that goes on to state is, what are some of the criticisms of stage models in general? And from that, we're going to go to James and Gilliland, 2017, where he points out that some of the authors in the book talk about a one size fits all model. And it talks about a one size fits all model doesn't work because each individual griever's experience is unique. Grief is not is not a unitary phenomenon, but rather a multidimensional, interactive, individual experience for every bereaved person based on a complex set of interwoven variables. Another um, Another counterpoint was that there are no fixed beginning and ending points in grieving. A lot of times people think, oh, well, you should start grieving at this point, and then once the person is gone, they're deceased, they're passed, you bury them, then that should be the end of the grieving process. When in reality, you really can't put a limit on grief because you have to think about the relationship that the person had with the deceased. You have to think about the mental capacity of the person that's still living. You have to think about whether there was some unfinished business between the person that's living and the one that's deceased. There's a lot of interbeing pieces that come into play, and so you can't really just say it's just fixed. You grieve when you first get the notification that the person has died, and then it ends after you bury them and you put them in a grave. That makes it so structured, and grief is anything but structured. Grief can come in a variety of waves, in a variety of ranges. And because each person is unique, the grieving process in and of itself is unique. And so it can't be fixed. And then it's also not that one size fit all approach where everybody grieves the same way, and then that's it, when reality is really not. Each person is unique. Grieving is going to be unique. It's going to be unique according to the person's personality. Some people might be extroverts and they might be rather loud in their grieving, according to some people, but to them, it's appropriate. So we have to look at that dynamic. And then the final counterpoint of grief is that while grief does not end, it changes. And how I understand that is that grief never really goes away. You go through different dimensions of grief. So, whereas grief is great in the beginning, when you first learn about the passing of a person as it goes on, your grief changes. Just like you as a person change, how you grieve changes. And that's how I understand that particular piece is that it doesn't end. It's continuously ongoing. For some people, it can go on until their demise. But it does change. It changes in the velocity of it. It changes in the dynamic of it. And it evolves depending on how the person goes through their grieving process. With that being said, the next part of the question is identify and describe at least one way in which crisis workers can identify. Oh, excuse me. The next question is what is meant by complicated grief? And by that, we also go again to James and Gilliland, 2017, where it talks about complicated grief. And complicated grief is basically defined as persons suffering from a complicated or prolonged grief are preoccupied with the deceased and may have reoccurrent, intrusive images or thoughts of the death. Common symptoms include shock, disbelief, and anger about the death, loneliness and isolation, a, a feeling that a part of the self has died along with the deceased, and a feeling that the future, holds little worth. That's what complicated grief is defined as. And so with that, it just means that, take for example, if you have a couple who's been together 50 years, and then one day one partner dies, the other partner can exhibit complicated grief because they just feel like that person that they were with for 50 years, that's half of a century. And because of the fact they spent so much time with that person, as that person died, it took a piece of them, because in reality they've been connected for so many years. It's almost as if a piece of them have died. And so that's part of the complicated grief process. They don't feel like there's anything worth more to live, because they figure if that piece of me have died, then the rest of it can just kind of go with it. Especially if the couple complemented each other, then it would seem like they're losing a whole half of their being with that person. And finally, the last part of our discussion question asks to identify and to describe at least one way in which crisis workers can identify someone who is experiencing complicated grief. And with that, I believe that a person that is experiencing complicated grief is if they are consistently talking about they're lonely. They're lonely. They're in a room full of people, but they're lonely. Friends come over and visit, but they're lonely. When they talk about a state of loneliness, even though they're surrounded by people, for me, I believe that would be a red flag for me, because I would want to identify where that loneliness is coming from and where that state is coming from. And so that would be one red flag for me when it came to complicated grief. Another identifier for me would be if a person was angry, unrelentless anger, I should say, where they just can't let it go. And every time they speak about the person, or every time the person's name is said, there's just a level of anger that stirs from them. I would also find that as a red flag, because I would want to know what's underlining that anger that they're experiencing. What is going on? What is that anger saying? What does that anger mean? How is that anger being identified within the person? I would want to go through those dynamics, because we don't know how a person may interpret certain things, and we don't know what the interpretation of that anger is. And so because of the fact that that would be a red flag for me, I would really want to find out what's behind that anger. how can we how can we peel that anger apart till we get to the core of it. So that would be a red flag for me. And then finally, I think the last point that would be a red flag for me would be a person talking about the unfairness of life. Life is not fair. It's not fair. Why does this have to happen to me? Why is this happening now? Why did it happen to them? That kind of language, that kind of verbiage, that would cause me to have a red flag, because I want to find out what's going on behind it. What more is in that scope that needs to be identified, because that can also stem from complicated grief, because there might have been some unresolved issues. There might be unfinished business. There might be something that's going on within that person, and they can't find the space to be able to keep it all together, and not keep it and not have it where they can go on, but it makes them stuck in that realm. So thank you so much for listening to my post, and I look forward to seeing you guys soon. Take care and have a great day.